Disowned for marrying someone outside my culture. Growing up, my life was mapped out for me before I ever had a say in it. I come from a deeply traditional family, where values are passed down like heirlooms, guarded fiercely and never questioned. Our culture is our identity, and to step outside its boundaries is to betray everything we are. From a young age, I understood that love, in the way the world outside defined it, was not meant for me. Marriage wasn't about romance or passion, it was about family, honor, and carrying on centuries-old customs. My parents, especially my father, took pride in this legacy. He often told stories of our ancestors, of arranged marriages that stood the test of time, of sacrifices made for the greater good of the family. My mother would nod in quiet agreement, her own life an embodiment of this duty. She had married young, as expected, to a man chosen for her. She always spoke of it with reverence, never regret, as though love was something that grew from obligation rather than choice. I never dared to question any of it. I knew my role. I would marry a man from our community, someone who spoke our language, understood our traditions, and followed our customs without hesitation. My future husband's family would merge seamlessly with mine, and we would continue the cycle that had existed for generations. This was what was expected. This was what was right. As a child, I even looked forward to it. My mother's life seemed full. She had a husband, children, a home where she was respected. She was the heart of our family, the one who kept everything together. I imagined myself growing into that role, learning the same recipes, hosting the same gatherings, and eventually passing these traditions down to my own children. There was comfort in that predictability, in knowing exactly how my life would unfold. But things started to shift when I got older. In my teenage years, I began to see cracks in the perfect image I had of my family. I saw the quiet sadness in my mother's eyes when she thought no one was looking, the way my aunts whispered about marriages that weren't as perfect as they seemed. I started to notice the expectations placed on the women in my family, how their dreams and ambitions often shrank in the face of duty. The thought of following the same path, of surrendering my choices before I even had a chance to make them, began to weigh on me. Yet, even with those doubts, I never considered breaking away. That wasn't an option. No one in our family had ever done it, not without consequences. I had heard the stories of distant relatives who had dared to marry outside our culture, and how their names were no longer spoken in our home. My father always said that turning your back on tradition was turning your back on family, and I never wanted to lose them. So I pushed those thoughts aside. I convinced myself that love wasn't something I needed, that my family's approval was more. It started as something small, something insignificant. Just a conversation. A moment in time that should have faded away as quickly as it arrived. But instead, it lingered, shaping the course of my life in ways I never could have anticipated. I met him on a rainy afternoon. The kind of day where the sky is weighed down with thick gray clouds, and the streets are slick with the remnants of an earlier storm. I had ducked into a cafe to escape the drizzle, shaking the droplets from my scarf as I stepped inside. It was warm in there, the scent of coffee and freshly baked bread wrapping around me like a familiar embrace. I didn't go to cafes often. I wasn't allowed to linger in places like this, where unfamiliar faces mingled freely, where my family wouldn't approve of me spending time alone. But that day, I needed a break. From the expectations, from the suffocating weight of always being watched. And that was when I saw him. He was sitting by the window, a book in one hand, a cup of coffee in the other. Something about him caught my attention before I even understood why. Maybe it was the way he seemed completely at ease, like the world outside didn't matter in that moment. Or maybe it was the quiet intensity in his expression, the way his eyes moved across the pages with such focus. I found a seat in the corner, forcing myself not to look in his direction. He was a stranger. That's all he was supposed to be. But fate has a way of unraveling even the most carefully laid plans. The cafe wasn't crowded, and yet, somehow, we ended up sitting next to each other. It started with a simple exchange. He asked if he could borrow a napkin from my table. I handed it to him without a word, thinking that would be the end of it. But then he smiled. And I smiled back. What followed was an easy conversation, the kind that sneaks up on you when you least expect it. We talked about the book he was reading, about how we both preferred the sound of rain to sunshine. I told him I had never been to this cafe before. He told me he came here often, that it was his favorite place to escape the noise of the world. We didn't exchange names that day. It felt like something sacred, something that would make the moment too real. But as I left the cafe, stepping back into the damp streets, I realized something unsettling. I wanted to see him again. And I had no idea what that would mean for the life I was supposed to live. I told myself it was nothing. A fleeting interaction. A brief moment of warmth on a cold day. But as the days passed, my thoughts betrayed me. I found myself replaying our conversation, the way he listened so intently, how his laughter had felt easy, natural. It was absurd. I didn't even know his name. And yet, the memory of him settled into my mind like ink soaking into paper, impossible to erase. I tried to shake it off, to return to my routine. But something had shifted. The world around me felt different, as if a door had opened to a life I had never dared to imagine. And for the first time, I wanted to step through it. A week passed before I saw him again. I hadn't planned on going back to the cafe, but something pulled me there. A quiet longing I refused to name. And there he was, in the same spot by the window, another book in his hands. This time, I didn't hesitate. I ordered my coffee, walked toward his table, and before I could change my mind, I spoke. "Is that seat taken?" He looked up, surprised at first. Then he smiled. And just like that, the moment stretched into something more. We talked longer this time. I learned that his name was Daniel, that he had grown up in the city but traveled often. He was a writer, though he hesitated to call himself one. He wrote because he loved stories, because words made sense when the world didn't. I told him I admired that, even though I had never dared to think about life in such poetic ways. Hours passed unnoticed. The rain outside had stopped, replaced by a soft glow from the streetlights. I hadn't meant to stay that long. I should have left after a few minutes, but the pull of the conversation was undeniable. I felt understood in a way I never had before, like I could breathe without thinking about how I was supposed to act, what I was supposed to say. When I finally rose to leave, Daniel hesitated before speaking. "Would you like to meet again?" I should have said no. I should have walked away. But I didn't. I nodded, my heart pounding, and we agreed to meet the following week. A simple agreement. One that shouldn't have meant anything. And yet, as I walked home, I knew something had changed. I was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something thrilling. A path that could lead me somewhere new, or tear apart everything I had ever known. For the first time in my life, I wasn't sure which terrified me more. The silence was worse than an outright confrontation. Amal didn't call. She didn't come to my house. But the weight of her knowing stare haunted me for days. I could feel the invisible countdown, each moment stretching unbearably as I waited for the inevitable. I tried to act normal, but my mother was perceptive. She watched me with narrowed eyes at dinner, questioning why I was fidgeting, why I barely touched my food. My father, ever the quieter of the two, simply observed, his silence more unsettling than any words. Then, on the fourth evening after Amal had seen me, my mother's phone rang. I knew. Before she even answered, before she pressed the device to her ear and murmured a greeting, I knew. I sat frozen at the table, gripping the edge so hard my knuckles turned white. I could hear Amal's voice through the speaker, though I couldn't make out the words. But I didn't need to. My mother's expression shifted, darkening like a sky before a storm. She ended the call with a clipped, "Thank you for telling me." Then she turned to me. "Who is he?" Her voice was ice. Not raised, not yet, but edged with something sharp. "The man you were seen with." My throat tightened. "He's just a friend. A friend." My mother repeated the words slowly, tasting them, testing them. "A friend you meet in secret? A friend you sneak around with?" I glanced at my father, but he said nothing. He didn't need to. His disappointment radiated from him like heat. "I wasn't sneaking. Do not lie to me." Her voice cut through my weak protest. "Do you have any idea what people will say? Do you know how much shame you have brought to this family?" Shame. That word, that terrible word, settled over me like a crushing weight. I wanted to defend myself. To tell her that I hadn't done anything wrong, that I had only been talking, that Daniel made me feel seen, that for the first time, I wasn't just my parents' daughter, my family's pride. I was simply me. But the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. The storm had begun, and I had no way to stop it.